One of the areas of Africa that really thrives in the Iron Age, in this age of the development of iron technology and commerce, is Northeast Africa. And here we're not talking about Egypt per se, though I will have something to say about Egypt, but more Nubia. And we've already talked about this in class, and so I don't want to rehash details we've already discussed, but I do want to delve into a few things here in connection with the themes of the development of iron and the development of commerce. So one of the things that is notable for the region of Nubia is that during the New Kingdom period of Egypt, they often removed, and this is especially the case under the reign of like the 14th and into the 13th century BCE, reigns of pharaohs like Ramses II, who wages this massive military campaign into Western Asia, right, into the Levant region, what is now Palestine, Israel. And as a result, these pharaohs, it seems, withdrew resources that had gone into the maintenance of their dominance over Nubia, right? And this is to the advantage of the Nubians. That even though the kingdom of Kerma had been destroyed by the New Kingdom pharaohs, that the areas further to the south, particularly the kingdom of Kush, which rises in this same period, benefits from this shift of focus of the Egyptians, right? There's also, we should say that the Egyptian, the pharaonic Egyptian polity, right, was extremely conservative in nature. We talked about how there was a royal monopoly on luxury goods and really on the trade in most things that were truly valuable. And thus there was a lack of a merchant class. And also we might say a failure to innovate, but really no motivation to innovate because Egypt was so stable, right? This is probably the main reason why iron technology does not diffuse into Egypt until about 500 BCE or so, much later than in other parts of Africa, as we've discussed, and certainly much, much later than what happens in Anatolia and in Western Asia. Now, Kush did not get iron technology any sooner. In fact, it probably is after that of Egypt, and iron probably diffuses from Egypt. But commerce does come to Kush earlier, perhaps, than Egypt. The Kushites are trading in goods over to the Red Sea and up into Egypt well before they procure iron technology, and they do, it seems, develop a merchant class earlier, right? And this is maybe one of the reasons why Kush becomes so strong during the period when the capital was in Napata, which we've talked about already, right? So that the rulers of Napata are able to take an army down into Lower Egypt and conquer the Nile Valley around 750 BCE and set themselves up as pharaohs ruling from the south. And it's also during this period that Kush expands its territory further to the south, down past the Dongola Reach, where, so we can look at the map here. Okay, so, here's the Dongola Reach, right, down into the region where Merowe is, which, again, we've discussed that, right? Now, the 25th dynasty lasts less than a century. It only lasts about 85 years. Before the Assyrians, who are based in Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia, come in and conquer Egypt. And now Kush is not conquered by the Assyrians, but the rulers of Kush withdraw to Napata, and Napata itself starts to wane in its importance. And more the political center, and especially the commercial and economic center, shifts further to the south. The kingdom of Kush survives, of course, but Napata itself is in decline. They continued to bury the kings of Kush in Nuri, which is this tomb complex of pyramids close to Napata, for several hundred years. It's not until probably 300 BCE or so that the burials shift to Merowe, which had become probably 100 or 200 years earlier the main city of the kingdom of Kush and kind of a political capital. But the tradition is such that they continue to bury in Nuri and to build these pyramids. Egypt was subsequently conquered when the Persians kind of take over most of the Near East. They came into the control of Egypt. Different dynasties and different empires exercised varying amounts of control. There were, at times, a kind of rebirth of native Egyptian power, like in the 4th century BCE. There's the rise of a native dynasty, but then at the end of the 4th century BCE, there's the conquest of Alexander the Great, and from 320, got to think about around 330, I guess it is, until the death of Cleopatra, which is in 31 BCE. The Ptolemies rule over Egypt, and this is the Hellenistic period, and things do change, and I'll talk about that in just a moment here. And then, of course, they're conquered by the Romans, and the Romans are big supporters of commerce, and Egypt becomes a tremendously important part of the Roman Empire, particularly in the strategy of Augustus Caesar to transform Rome into a kind of autocracy, right? So let's take a look at Meroe, right? So the shift to the south, where the kings start to inhabit Meroe, is the exact time period of this is uncertain. It's sometime between the Assyrian conquest of Egypt in 664 BCE and around 300 BCE. And this may have been a gradual thing where the kings of Kush are spending more and more time in the south and kind of moving back and forth, and eventually they just take up habitation in Meroe. So it might not be just a singular decision, right, where they shift it to the south. Meroe was tied in very closely to the growth of commerce in the Red Sea region. And this is spurred even further after Alexander the Great conquers Egypt, because it's at that point that Egypt does become commercial, particularly with the rise and ascension of the city of Alexandria, which is the Ptolemaic capital. So it's the Ptolemaic dynasty named after Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander the Great's generals. He becomes the first in that dynasty. And the Ptolemies build this capital in Alexandria, which is right on the coast in the Nile Delta. And it quickly becomes probably the largest city in the world. I mean, at its height, it had a population probably north of 500,000 people, maybe closer to 1 million people. Unfortunately, most of ancient Alexandria is now underwater or has been destroyed and looted, and so there's not much of that city left. There's actually not a lot of archaeology we can do about ancient Alexandria, despite its importance in that period. But Alexandria becomes a kind of cosmopolitan melting pot and an economic center. The Ptolemies recognized the importance of trade. They, of course, were Macedonians who had adopted Greek culture, and the Greeks were merchants and tended to live in city-states. And Alexandria is not a city-state, it's more of a capital of an empire, but that commercial model they carried with them, right? And so this benefits the kingdom of Kush, now based in Meroe, because there are goods and even eventually finished products that are being produced and that come from this region that are in high demand in Alexandria and in points beyond that, right? So they're shipping things through the Red Sea or down the Nile to Alexandria and then trading them there, where they are then sent to other parts of the world. It's during this period, this Hellenistic period, that Meroe even becomes the center, kind of a manufacturing hub for cotton textiles. And for the production of iron, even though it probably doesn't have iron until around 300 BCE, but it quickly becomes a kind of center for manufacture of iron. The government of Meroe really functioned sort of like a city-state, and it was not the only urban center. There were several urban centers along the Nile in Kush, but Meroe was the most important of these. In Meroe itself, and probably there were equivalent elite kind of political figures in other cities in Kush, you have the king or the government officials who form a kind of elite caste there. But the function of the city was no longer, as it had been, in the the period of the pharaohs, and probably even Napata was this way, where it's just a kind of ritual center, the seat of the ruler, and this whole process of procuring the luxury goods which are taken to the center, and then the ruler distributes them among among the elites as gifts, and creates this network of kind of this power network, right? That's no longer what's happening in Merowe. And so it's almost certain that a significant merchant class arises at this point, and they're the ones who are organizing the trade out to the Red Sea. The Red Sea is about 400 kilometers away from Merowe, and so it's a fair distance, but it's not an impassable distance. It's less than 250 miles, and so they've got camel caravans and things like that traveling out through the steppe region to the Red Sea, trading with South Arabia, and also a significant population of craftsmen producing things like the cotton cloth and the iron and other things, right? And then the majority of people were servants and laborers who were living in the cities. They were, doing the work, they were building, they were, and they're probably drawn from the surrounding population of farmers. Merowe almost certainly had a significant slave population as well, taken from war captives and possibly criminals and debtors and these sorts of things. But the vast majority of people are in this kind of servant and laborer class or caste. This does become a melting pot, though, right? You have a mix of ethnicities, people from speaking Nilo-Saharan languages, the Sudanic languages, right, from further to the west. You have people who are speaking Afroasiatic or even like Semitic languages coming from the Horn of Africa. You've got the Meroitic language, which is also Afroasiatic, related to the Egyptian languages being spoken in Merowe itself, right? And so different people were coming to these places, to these cities, especially to Merowe, to trade and take up residence there. Some of them are pastoralists, some of them are agriculturalists, some of them now become urban dwellers in this setting. There's also a rich religious and ethnic mix. The Egyptian pantheon of gods seems to inflect this, but for the most part, the people of Merowe appear to have continued to worship the single divinity, even if they're using Egyptian names and Egyptian idioms and Egyptian style art and these sorts of things, right? They tend to emphasize the worship of single deities. During the period of Napata, this was the deity of Amun, or they used the name Amun, but this really probably was just an adopted name for the Sudanic sky deity, right? Which was, again, as we said, a monotheistic or at least henotheistic religion. In the Merowe period, the main god is this one called Apetamek, and this is a lion god, and so it's shown with that idiom. There is obvious Egyptian influence in its portrayal. An interesting feature of Merowe as well, this is not in the city itself, but in the steppe region to the east, they were constructing earthen dams. And this probably started with pastoralists doing this so that they could create reservoirs to water their animals. But the agriculturalists learned from this probably and started to do what is called recessional agriculture or something like that, where the waters, they create these dams, which these are riverbeds that dry up in the dry season, and when the rains come, they flow again. And so they would create these dams to try to preserve the water there. And as the waters receded into the earth, they would plant the crops in the moist soil and have enough moisture there to maintain the crops through its growing season. Right, so this is an important innovation that allows them to grow more food and to sustain a greater population. The language, unfortunately, is indecipherable of ancient Merowe, right? They did have a writing system, and the phonetic values of the different characters are known, but the meanings of most of the words have not been deciphered. And so scholars are still working on this. I'm not sure what the state of knowledge is at this point. But this is a barrier to understanding what was going on in Merowe. We've already looked at some of the pyramid complexes. You can see these steep pyramids. Okay. We also talked about how this figure called the Kandake, which is borrowed later by Aksum. The queen could be as important as the king, and in some cases, this place seems to have been ruled by female rulers. Right. This is the temple of Petamak, and you can see here that the Greek influence has made its presence felt, as it were, right? These are, kind of Greek-style columns with quasi-Corinthian capitals with a little bit of African flair. Looks like palm fronds coming out of here, but the Greek and Roman influence is pretty obvious. You can see the Roman arch here, the rounded arch, right? And so this was part of the larger Hellenistic Roman cultural world, and these cultural borrowings are apparent, right, to see here. Okay. I'm going to stop there. I will do another video on Aksum, a brief video, but we'll save that for next time.